Hello and welcome to this premium podcast, The Lotus Eaters, in which Carl has been going through the critical race theory Bible and is going to give us an overview of all of the nonsense within.
Yep, so the book is called Critical Race Theory, The Key Writings That Form the Movement. It's got a foreword by Cornel West, and it's edited by Kimberly Crenshaw, Neil Gotander, Gary Pellett, and Kendall Thomas. And Crenshaw has written an extensive introduction in the beginning, and so I read it because it's a university text. If you're going to do critical race theory at university, this is what you are issued with. It's 500 pages of pure hell. Have you ever seen the film Event Horizon?
No, I haven't.
Right, you should watch it because it's an excellent film. But at one point, this crew find like a spaceship that's come back from the outer space, and they don't know where it's been. It's been through like an alternate dimension to hell, and it's very much like this.
Is that the one where the guy comes back and he's like lost his mind?
Yes, and he tears out his own eyes. He's like, "We won't need eyes where we're going," and things like that. And that's basically what critical race theory is. It's going through the singularity into a demonic realm. Right, so this is
a thumbnail for this now. We don't need eyes where we're going.
That's fine. You know, if you want to Photoshop Kimberly Crenshaw with like Sam Neill's scars or something, fine, because that's what this is, right? So let's just go through sort of where critical race theory came from. So it comes out of the critical theory tradition, which is why it's called critical X theory, and this they build on essentially the 70s French radicals like Foucault, Derrida, de Beauvoir, a bunch of others, right? But anyway, so in the main, they say critical race theory embraces a movement of left scholars, most of them scholars of colour, situated in law schools, whose work challenges the ways in which race and culture and racial power are constructed and represented in American legal culture and more generally in American society as a whole. And it's unified by two particular interests. The first is how to understand a regime of white supremacy and its subordination of people of colour has been created and maintained in America, and in particular to examine the relationship between that social structure and professed ideals such as the rule of law and equal protection. And the second is a desire not merely to understand the vexed bond between law and racial power, but to change it. And so what they view is the entire United States is the product of white racial consciousness. And they are not white racially conscious, and so they view themselves as being outside of that. And of course, the point of the critical part of critical theory is not just to analyze something, but to frame it in such a way as it demands change, that it demands that it must be changed. So if you accept their framing, then you have to change something. And they say, we believe that legal scholarship about race in America can never be written from a distance of detachment or with an attitude of objectivity, which means, as many of the essayists in this book say, is they have an explicit avowal and embracing of racial consciousness and subjectivity. That's what they're doing. So there is no point appealing to an objective standard in anything because they reject that prima facie. They say, and the problem with that, of course, is, as they say, the American cultural mainstream has neatly linked the black left to the white racist right. According to this quickly coalesced consensus, because race consciousness characterizes both white supremacists and black nationalists, it followed that they were both racists, which is a correct analysis, which is why it was such an easily agreed upon consensus. Those people saying, white people only, or those people saying black people only, are a bunch of racists. And so
But that's an objective standard.
It is an objective standard, and it's also a liberal standard, and they're not liberals, they're Marxists explicitly, and they're like far beyond what Marx could ever have envisaged his philosophy doing, but they are in that tradition. But the point is that this is explicit. They are the black mirror of the white nationalists, and they know it. And they say, with this explicit embrace of race consciousness, critical race theory aims to re-examine the terms by which race and racism has been negotiated in American consciousness and recover and revitalize the radical tradition of race consciousness among African Americans and other peoples of color, a tradition that was discarded when integration, assimilation, and the ideal of colorblindness became the official norms of the Enlightenment. And that's because they are the official norms of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment rejects subjectivity and embraces objectivity and universality. If you're going to embrace subjectivity, you have to embrace particularity. And so, unsurprisingly, the Enlightenment isn't pro-racism, but they are. as we understand racism. Of course, they redefine racism to mean something else. But again, the main point is exactly the same as the white nationalists. They reject integration. They don't want integration. Integration to them, as one essay frames it, is cultural genocide. And if they had the balls, they'd have gone as far to say black genocide, because it would also, I suppose they would also count it as meaning a kind of racial genocide on a biological level as well. But anyway.
Blacks and black culture.
Yeah.
Again, a very American term. But I also like that they picked up on the historical point there, that they said, there's this old tradition, as there was before the integrationist movement, of, let's say, black advocates, as these things would have been framed.
Yeah.
Of people like Marcus Garvey and whatnot, who were just open black nationalists. Yeah. We want separate states, all the rest of it. Mirror image. And we want to revive that tradition.
Yes. And
Could not be more explicit about their goals.
No, they couldn't be more explicit. And the thing is, they're very intelligent. They've leveraged their position as victims and political victims in order to be able to gestate this ideology within the American legal academy. Whereas the white nationalists obviously didn't have that leverage, because they couldn't say, well, we're the political victims of black people, and therefore no one was giving them any sympathy, no one gave them any time, any resources, any space in the academy. But these people were, because of this victim status.
But they don't deserve any of it.
No, not at all, obviously. Unless, of course, you're a white nationalist. And then you would agree with them. But anyway, so let's go through the history of critical race theory. So Crenshaw says that it emerged in the 80s, and in Crenshaw's opinion, it marks an important point in the history of racial politics in the legal academy and in the broader conversation about race and racism in the nation as a whole. And where we are now, where critical race theory is the dominant racial understanding of the left, is correct. She's won this fight. And you may remember that we did our, Origin of Intersectionality podcast in 1989 with, it was not Mapping the Margins, it was the one before that, but it's got a really long title, some marginal analysis.
Yeah, it was extremely long and boring and weird.
Yeah, but a black feminist analysis, blah, blah, blah. Well, that was written in 1989, and so this is a precursor to that, and she comes out of that tradition. You can't separate critical race theory from intersectionality, because they're essentially one and the same. I mean, I saw Crenshaw's got, I think, 3 essays in this.
I think she's a co-editor as well.
And she's the co-editor, and she wrote the foreword, the introduction. So, yes, she is embedded in critical race theory. You can't separate the two out.
I can't believe a person like that gets such free reign. I mean, when you're writing the foreword in which you're literally like, so the tradition of black nationalism, that's what we need.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, you're invited by ministers to come and speeches.
This whole thing is a product of a lack of gatekeeping, that's correct. Right? She says, a predominantly white left emerged on the law school scene in the late 70s, development which played a central role in the genesis of critical race theory. Organised by a collection of neo-Marxist intellectuals, former New Left activists, ex-counterculturalists, and other varieties of oppositionalists in law schools, the Conference on Critical Legal Studies established itself as a network of openly leftist law students, teachers, practitioners committed to exposing and challenging the ways American law served to legitimize an oppressive social order. So a lack of gatekeeping of leftists did this. Now, in the middle of the Cold War, I find that surprising. How could you get openly Marxist people in a legal academy operating? Why weren't these people just yeeted? Boggles the mind. She says, by the late 70s, critical legal studies had existed in a swirl of formative energy, cultural insurgency, and organising momentum. It had established itself as a politically, philosophically, and methodologically eclectic, but intellectually sophisticated and ideologically left movement in legal academia. And that seems to be true. Critical race theory evolved out of critical legal studies because critical legal studies was dominated by white people, and they used the same arguments against critical legal studies that critical legal studies used against the American legal system. Derrick Bell, at this time, was a Harvard professor, and he wrote a book called Race, Racism, and American Law. Now, Derrick Bell is probably the person you could lay the the foundational root on. He's the original guy.
It's the first essay, isn't it?
He is the first. He's got a few essays in here. One of them is called Racial Realism. Yeah. Well, he's the anti-integrationist, who,
yes.
And we'll do a podcast specifically on his essays at some point. But he's very black-pilled about it. He's like, blacks will never achieve racial equality in America. It's like, oof, okay,
defining equality as supremacy again,
kind
or
of
separatism.
Because
I know his opening essay is about separatism.
Yeah, he's thinking of a sort of parallel black society that will never have the equality with the white society it becomes parallel to. But anyway, Crenshaw credits him with developing and teaching legal doctrine from a race-conscious viewpoint after writing his book. And she credits him with the central position in the development of critical race theory because of his opposition to the traditional liberal approach to racism. As in, racism is something that you do, not a consequence that you receive.
It's also bad.
Yeah.
I love that. The liberal approach to racism is saying it's bad.
Yeah. And he's like, actually,
yeah,
let me recover the term racism. After he left Harvard to become the dean of the University of Oregon Law School, don't know why they'd hire that guy, but okay. Harvard students had a protest to demand that another black professor was given his position and ended up having rallies, boycotts, sit-ins, and a takeover of the dean's office at Harvard in the late 70s. So nothing new under the sun. What we've been seeing like 2016, it's just all coming around again. And they are the children of people like Derrick Bell, like the ideological children. During one boycott, a group of radical students founded something they called the alternative course. Now, those students who are well-versed in critical race theory will demand that you tell them what things like the alternative course were. So you can reply with, well, it was a student-led continuation of Bell's course, which focused on American law taught through the prism of race. As Crenshaw says, the alternative course was in many ways the first institutionalized expression of critical race theory. It was a useful point to mark the genesis of CRT. So she puts the actual separation of critical race theory to critical legal studies at the point where the alternative course is taking place. And so by 1986, in a critical legal studies conference, the CRT break with the critical legal studies begins to occur. A bunch of critical feminists wanted the organizers to host scholars of color to facilitate discussions on race. And she notes that CLS, as a white institution, drew a surprisingly defensive response. The pitched and heated exchange that erupted in response to our query, what is it about the whiteness of CLS that discourages participation by people of colour, revealed that CLS's hip, cutting-edge irreverence towards establishment practices could easily disintegrate into hand-wringing hysteria when brought back home, which revealed critical legal studies to be a site of hierarchy and power as well. Exactly the same argument in exactly the same way, because here's a group of white people. Well, why aren't brown people and black people involved? And it's like, well, they can be. It's like, but why aren't they? You're a site of hierarchy and power. And it's like, we were just doing the work that you all agree with. It's like, yeah, but you're white. We're not. What now? It's like, well, there we go.
I don't know. Why couldn't you make the same argument against the critical race theorists and like critical gender theorists or something?
You absolutely could. Critical Native American theorists can come out of this in exactly the same way.
Oh yeah, they're more victims.
Well, absolutely. You're the colonizers on their land, and it's a continual recursive spiral. And so eventually there will be something like critical Native studies. Well, why is critical race theory all full of black people and no Native Americans? How dare you? How could you do this? And you'll be like, well, we include Native. This is the same response that the critical legal scholars had, the same response the American establishment had, and it is a continual chain of backbiting and backstabbing. And so this is what the point that facilitated really the break between CRT and CLS. And after the 1987 conference, the race crits, as they call themselves, began thinking of their project as uncovering how law was a constitutive element of race itself, how law constructed race. And there is some argument to this in America because, of course, go back to the 1700s.
The one-drop rule, things like this.
You do have these things.
But those are all gone.
Apart from the fact that they're all gone, there are Supreme in their defense.
It's just funny.
There are Supreme Court precedents that still have race as a factor, right? Because of American history.
Hate crimes.
Things like that, exactly. Right, but there are still things that do concern themselves with race. But more importantly, this is very American. You can't take this out of the American context and apply it anywhere else because it doesn't work. Because you don't have the same history as America, you don't have the same law as America. If you don't have a common law legal system, it doesn't make sense.
You can't apply it anywhere else and have it be coherent.
No.
It doesn't work in America either, but it's at least coherent there as like you can make the argument and so on and so forth.
You can't just say it doesn't work in America. It does work in America, which is why America is falling to critical race theory.
Okay, in that sense.
It does work if this is what you want to do. But the question is, why do you want to do it? Because what you're creating is a parallel black nationalist sort of race that doesn't have any legal obligation to the rest of the races in the United States. So it's essentially a sort of black ethno-state that's being carved out in the United States. And they're explicit about this over the essays that they go through. And so let's take an overview of the text itself. So this is 500 pages that's split into 7 sections that comprises 27 essays in total.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.